Deep in the haunted hollows of Appalachia, where blood-soaked secrets whisper through the pines, join us to uncover chilling tales of terror that'll make you hit that subscribe button to never miss another nightmare. Deep in the misty hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where federal law was more of a suggestion than reality, certain family names carried the weight of legend and terror. These weren't ordinary mountain folks struggling to make a living from harsh land. These were bloodlines that had twisted survival into something far darker, creating their own brutal kingdoms where mercy was weakness and violence was currency. Today, we're exploring the most dangerous family dynasties in American history, clans so ruthless that even hardened lawmen would rather turn a blind eye than venture into their territory. What you're about to hear isn't found in any history textbook. These stories were deliberately buried, just like many of the victims who crossed these infamous families. We're talking about generations of bloodshed, territorial wars that lasted decades, and family traditions built on fear and brutality. From feuds that nearly sparked wars between states to criminal empires that defied federal authority for generations, these 7 families redefined what it meant to be dangerous in America. Hit that subscribe button because this journey into America's darkest family secrets is just beginning. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why certain parts of Appalachia were considered no-go zones for over a century. Let's start with perhaps the most infamous of all Appalachian family feuds. The Hatfields of West Virginia weren't just mountain folk trying to get by. They were a clan that turned violence into an art form, led by the imposing figure known as Devil Anse Hatfield, William Anderson. Hatfield got his nickname not from any supernatural abilities, but from his absolutely ruthless approach to settling disputes. Standing over 6 feet tall, with piercing eyes and a beard that reached his chest, Devil Anse commanded respect through fear. The Hatfield Empire was built on 3 pillars: logging operations that controlled vast stretches of West Virginia timber, moonshine distribution networks that reached into multiple states, and a family loyalty so fierce that crossing one Hatfield meant war with them all. What made them particularly dangerous wasn't just their willingness to use violence, but their strategic thinking. Devil Anse didn't just react to threats, he anticipated them, often striking first and asking questions later. The family compound along the Tug Fork River became legendary among locals. Visitors described it as a fortress where armed men patrolled the perimeter and strangers were watched from the moment they entered Hatfield territory. The main house sat on elevated ground with clear sightlines in all directions, and family members were trained from childhood to handle firearms with deadly precision. Children as young as 10 could outshoot most grown men, and family loyalty was drilled into them with the same intensity as marksmanship. But it was their conflict with the McCoys that truly revealed the depths of Hatfield brutality. The infamous New Year's Massacre of 1888 showed just how far this family was willing to go. On that bitter cold night, a group of Hatfields surrounded the McCoy cabin, where Randolph McCoy's family had gathered for the holiday. What happened next shocked even the violence-hardened residents of the region. The Hatfields set the cabin ablaze, then positioned themselves around the building to gun down anyone who tried to escape the flames. As family members fled the burning structure, they were cut down by rifle fire. When Sarah McCoy, Randolph's wife, tried to help her wounded daughter. She was beaten so severely with a rifle butt that she never fully recovered. Two of the McCoy children died in the fire, while others were shot as they ran for the forest. What made this attack particularly chilling was its calculated nature. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, born from heated emotions. The Hatfields had planned this assault, positioning men strategically and timing it for maximum psychological impact. They wanted to send a message that would echo through the mountains, cross the Hatfields, and your entire bloodline would pay the price. The violence escalated to such extremes that state governors became involved, calling in militia forces to restore order. Newspapers across the country followed the feud with fascination and horror, turning the Hatfield name into a symbol of mountain lawlessness. Even today, over a century later, descendants of the family speak of an inherited anger that seems to run in their blood, as if the capacity for violence had become encoded in their DNA. What many people don't realize is that the Hatfield legacy extended far beyond their famous feud. The family's influence shaped the development of entire regions of West Virginia. Their logging operations employed hundreds of men, but these weren't ordinary jobs. Workers understood that employment came with an unspoken agreement. Loyalty to the Hatfield family superseded loyalty to law enforcement or government authority. The moonshine operations were equally sophisticated. The Hatfields didn't just make liquor, they controlled distribution networks that stretched from West Virginia to major cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. They had arrangements with railroad workers, riverboat captains, and even some law enforcement officers who looked the other way in exchange for their cut of the profits. This wasn't just a family business, it was a criminal empire disguised as mountain tradition. Perhaps most disturbing was how the family dealt with internal disputes. Devil ants ruled with absolute authority, but succession wasn't guaranteed to fall to the eldest son. Family members had to prove themselves worthy through displays of loyalty and ruthlessness. Stories persist of brothers being forced to choose sides in manufactured conflicts, with the winners earning their place in the family hierarchy and the losers disappearing into the mountain mist. The Hatfield compound included what locals called the deciding ground, a clearing where family disputes were settled through combat. These weren't fair fights with established rules. They were brutal affairs where weapons were allowed, and mercy was considered weakness. Family members who showed hesitation or compassion during these trials found themselves on the wrong end of Devil Ants's judgment. Even as law enforcement pressure increased and the federal government began taking interest in the family's activities, the Hatfields adapted rather than retreated. They developed an early warning system using strategically placed lookouts throughout the mountains. Signal fires could communicate danger across miles of terrain faster than any telegraph, and the family maintained safe houses and hidden supply caches throughout their territory. The most chilling aspect of the Hatfield legacy is how their methods influenced other mountain families. The combination of family loyalty, territorial control, and absolute ruthlessness became a template that other clans would follow for generations. They proved that in the right circumstances, a single family could create their own law, their own justice system, and their own kingdom built on fear. When Devil Ants Hatfield finally died in 1921, Over 1,000 people attended his funeral. But this wasn't just a gathering to mourn a community leader. It was a display of power that showed how deeply the Hatfield influence had penetrated mountain society. Law enforcement officers stood alongside known criminals, all paying their respects to a man who had spent decades defying their authority. The Hatfield name still carries weight in certain parts of West Virginia. Descendants of the family speak of feeling the burden of their ancestors' reputation of being watched and judged differently because of their bloodline. Some have tried to distance themselves from the family history, while others embrace it as a source of pride and identity. What makes the Hatfield story particularly fascinating is how it reveals the complex relationship between family, territory, and power in American history. This wasn't just a criminal organization that happened to be related. This was a family that used blood ties as the foundation for a system of control that lasted for generations. They understood that loyalty based on family bonds was stronger than loyalty based on money or fear alone. The techniques they developed for maintaining control, gathering intelligence, and projecting power would later be studied by law enforcement agencies trying to understand how criminal organizations operate. The Hatfields weren't just mountain outlaws, they were innovators who created new models for organized crime that would influence criminal enterprises well into the modern era. Today, tourists can visit sites associated with the Hatfield legacy, but locals still speak of certain areas where outsiders aren't welcome. There are valleys and ridges where the Hatfield influence lingers like morning fog, places where the old rules still apply, and questions about family business aren't appreciated. The mountains remember, and some secrets refuse to be buried, no matter how much time passes. The Hatfield story serves as our introduction to this dark chapter of American history because it demonstrates how quickly civilization can break down when geography, poverty, and family loyalty combine in exactly the wrong way. These weren't evil people who chose violence for its own sake. They were individuals who adapted to circumstances that required them to be more ruthless than their neighbors, and once that adaptation was complete, there was no going back. As we continue our journey through the deadliest families of Appalachia, remember that the Hatfields were just at the beginning. Each family we'll encounter found their own unique ways to survive and prosper in a landscape that offered few legitimate opportunities for advancement. Some turned to supernatural beliefs, others to criminal enterprise, and still others to practices so disturbing that they challenge our understanding of what human beings are capable of when pushed to their limits. The mountains keep their secrets well, but today we're pulling back the veil on family legacies that shaped American history in ways most people never realized. The Hatfield name might be the most famous, but as you're about to discover, they were far from the most dangerous family to call the Appalachian Mountains home. Moving deeper into the blood-soaked hollows of Appalachian history, we encounter the second family in our deadly series. Where the Hatfields ruled through calculated violence and territorial dominance, the McCoys of Kentucky represented something equally dangerous, but fundamentally different. They were the other half of America's most infamous mountain feud, a family that transformed personal grievance into generational warfare, proving that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who believes they're fighting for justice. Randolph McCoy, known to locals as Old Randolph, wasn't born into violence the way Devil Anse Hatfield seemed to be. He was a farmer, a family man who worked hard to carve out a living from the unforgiving Kentucky mountains. But what made the McCoys particularly dangerous wasn't their capacity for brutality, though they certainly possessed that in abundance. It was their ability to nurse grudges until they became something far more toxic than simple anger. The McCoys didn't just fight, they transformed suffering into a family tradition that would consume 3 generations. The spark that ignited the most famous feud in American history seemed almost absurdly trivial. In 1878, Floyd Hatfield claimed ownership of a pig that Randolph McCoy insisted belonged to him. The dispute went to local magistrate Anderson Hatfield, Devil Anse's cousin, who ruled in favor of the Hatfield claim. The decision was based largely on the testimony of Bill Staton, a McCoy relative who had married into the Hatfield clan. For most families, this would have been an embarrassing loss, perhaps worth a few heated words at the general store. For the McCoys, it became the foundation of a blood debt that would define their family for decades. What distinguished the McCoys from other mountain families was their absolute inability to let grievances die. Where other clans might settle disputes through violence and then move on, the McCoys cataloged every slight, every injustice, every moment of perceived disrespect. They maintained what family members called the accounting, a mental ledger of wrongs that demanded payment in blood. This wasn't mere stubbornness, it was a family philosophy that elevated revenge to the level of religious duty. The pig trial revealed something crucial about McCoy psychology. They didn't just want to win disputes, they wanted to be acknowledged as righteous. When Bill Staton testified against his own McCoy blood relatives, it wasn't just betrayal in their eyes, it was a cosmic injustice that demanded correction. 2 years later, Staton was found dead, shot through the head while checking his fishing lines. The McCoys never officially claimed responsibility, but they didn't deny it either. In their worldview, Staton had chosen his side, and consequences were inevitable. The McCoy family compound along the Tug Fork River became a fortress of resentment. Unlike the Hatfield stronghold, which projected strength and intimidation, the McCoy property reflected their siege mentality. Visitors described a place where suspicion hung in the air like morning fog, where conversations stopped when strangers approached, where even children seemed to carry the weight of inherited anger. The main house was positioned to provide clear sightlines of approaching visitors, but also to minimize exposure to potential attackers. This wasn't the home of aggressors, it was the headquarters of people who believed the world was actively conspiring against them. Randolph McCoy's personality perfectly embodied this family trait. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who could recall every slight going back decades, who would bring up ancient grievances in casual conversation, who seemed incapable of experiencing joy without immediately remembering some past injustice that diminished it. His wife Sarah was reportedly the only person who could calm his rages, but even she couldn't heal the deep wells of resentment that seemed to define his character. The McCoys' approach to the feud differed significantly from the Hatfields' calculated strategy. Where Devil Anse planned his moves like a military commander, the McCoys reacted with the fury of the perpetually wronged. Their violence was more personal, more emotional, and ultimately more self-destructive. They fought not just to win, but to make their enemies understand the depth of their pain. This psychological component made them unpredictable and in many ways more dangerous than their more strategic rivals. The turning point came in 1882 when three McCoy brothers attended an Election Day celebration in Pike County. What should have been a routine community gathering became a bloodbath when the brothers encountered Devil Ance's son, Ellison Hatfield. The exact details of what triggered the violence remain disputed, but the outcome was clear. Ellison Hatfield was stabbed and shot, and the three McCoy brothers were captured by Hatfield forces. What happened next revealed the fundamental difference between the two families' approaches to justice. Devil Anse, demonstrating his cold pragmatism, held the McCoy brothers prisoner while Ellison clung to life. If his son survived, the brothers would face trial. If Ellison died, they would be executed immediately. This calculated approach to revenge, linking punishment directly to outcome, showed the Hatfield capacity for strategic thinking, even in moments of extreme emotion. When Ellison Hatfield died the next day, Devil Anse kept his word. The three McCoy brothers were tied to pawpaw trees and executed by firing squad. But the Hatfields weren't content with simple execution. Witnesses reported that after the brothers were clearly dead, the Hatfield forces continued firing into the bodies while shouting one more for the McCoys. This wasn't just revenge, it was theater designed to send a message about the cost of crossing the Hatfield clan. The execution of the three McCoy brothers transformed Randolph from an angry farmer into something approaching a madman. The loss of his sons didn't just grieve him, it validated every paranoid suspicion he'd ever harbored about his enemies. He began to see Hatfield conspiracies everywhere, interpreting every setback, every piece of bad luck, every minor dispute as part of an elaborate campaign to destroy his family. This paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified, as the Hatfields did indeed have extensive influence throughout the region. But Randolph's response went far beyond rational caution. The McCoys' thirst for revenge led them to make alliances that other mountain families would have considered beneath their dignity. They reached out to Kentucky law enforcement, federal marshals, and even newspaper reporters, transforming their personal vendetta into a public relations campaign. This represented a fundamental break with mountain tradition, where family disputes were supposed to be settled within the community. By involving outside authorities, the McCoys violated an unspoken code that had governed Appalachian conflicts for generations. The family's desperation became increasingly apparent as the feud escalated. Unlike the Hatfields, who could draw on extensive business networks and political connections, the McCoys found themselves increasingly isolated. Their willingness to cooperate with federal authorities made them pariahs among many mountain families who valued independence above all else. They were fighting not just the Hatfields, but the entire cultural system that protected mountain autonomy from outside interference. The McCoy women played a particularly tragic role in the escalating violence. Sarah McCoy, Randolph's wife, became the family's unofficial strategist, helping to plan retaliations and coordinate with law enforcement. Her daughter Rosanna's romance with John Hatfield had initially offered hope for peace between the families, but when the relationship ended badly, it became another grievance in the McCoys' growing catalog of wrongs. The women of the family weren't just victims of the violence, they were active participants who often pushed for more extreme measures than the men were willing to consider. The New Year's Massacre of 1888 represented the absolute nadir of McCoy fortunes. When the Hatfields surrounded the family cabin on that bitter January night, they weren't just attacking a rival clan, they were targeting a family that had been systematically weakened by years of violence and isolation. The McCoys who died in the burning cabin weren't warriors falling in glorious battle. They were victims of a conflict that had long since spiraled beyond any rational purpose. What made the massacre particularly horrifying was how it revealed the complete breakdown of mountain justice. The Hatfields didn't attack during a fair fight or in immediate response to some provocation. They came in overwhelming force against a family celebrating the new year with their children. When Sarah McCoy tried to help her wounded daughter, she was beaten with rifle butts by men who had known her for decades. This wasn't warfare, it was extermination. The aftermath of the massacre showed both the McCoys' resilience and their ultimate powerlessness. Randolph survived, but he was broken in ways that went beyond physical injury. His wife, Sarah, never fully recovered from her beating, suffering from headaches and confusion for the rest of her life. The family's remaining members scattered, some leaving the mountains entirely, others retreating into isolated hollows where they nursed their grievances in solitude. What's often overlooked in popular accounts of the feud is how the McCoys' tragedy became a cautionary tale for other mountain families. Their willingness to involve outside authorities, their inability to contain their anger, their transformation of personal grievance into public spectacle, all served as examples of how not to conduct family business. The McCoys became symbols of what happened when mountain pride overwhelmed mountain wisdom. The family's legacy in Kentucky folklore is complex and often contradictory. They're remembered as victims of Hatfield aggression, but also as the family whose stubbornness and vindictiveness helped destroy the traditional ways of mountain life. Their cooperation with federal marshals and newspaper reporters opened the door for outside interference in mountain affairs, fundamentally changing how conflicts were resolved in Appalachian communities. Randolph McCoy lived until 1914, dying at the age of 88, but those who knew him in his final years described a man haunted by the ghosts of his dead children. He never stopped believing that justice had been denied, never stopped waiting for vindication that would never come. His final words, according to family members, were a request that someone count his sons, as if he still couldn't accept that they were gone. The psychological profile that emerges from studying the McCoys reveals a family trapped by their own righteousness. They genuinely believed they were the victims of an elaborate conspiracy, and this belief justified increasingly extreme responses to perceived threats. Unlike criminal families who embraced their outlaw status, the McCoys saw themselves as defenders of justice, fighting against overwhelming corruption. This self-image made compromise impossible and ensured that conflicts would escalate rather than resolve. Modern psychologists studying the feud have identified what they call McCoy syndrome, a pattern of behavior where legitimate grievances become so central to identity that resolving them becomes psychologically impossible. The family needed their enemies more than they needed peace, because without the Hatfields to hate, They would have been forced to confront the emptiness at the center of their existence. The McCoys also represented something uniquely American in their approach to justice. They believed deeply in the idea that wrong should be righted, that bad behavior should have consequences, that the universe itself demanded balance. When traditional mountain justice failed them, they turned to federal authority, but when that too proved inadequate, they were left with nothing but their anger and their memories. The family's relationship with violence differed markedly from the Hatfields' more calculated approach. McCoy violence was personal, emotional, and often self-defeating. They fought like people who had nothing left to lose, because in many ways they didn't. Each death, each setback, each moment of humiliation only reinforced their belief that they were righteous sufferers in an unjust world. The economic impact of the feud on the McCoy family was devastating. While the Hatfields used the conflict to consolidate their business interests and expand their influence, the McCoys found themselves increasingly impoverished. Their focus on revenge prevented them from pursuing legitimate opportunities for advancement, and their reputation for violence made them poor business partners. They became prisoners of their own grievances, unable to move forward because they couldn't let go of the past. Perhaps most tragically, the McCoys' children grew up knowing nothing but hatred and violence. The family's younger generation inherited not just the feud itself, but the psychological patterns that made resolution impossible. They learned to see every interaction through the lens of family honor, every setback as evidence of conspiracy, every stranger as a potential enemy. This toxic inheritance ensured that even when the original combatants were dead, the essential conflict would continue. The McCoy story serves as our second example of Appalachian family violence because it demonstrates how quickly legitimate grievances can metastasize into something far more destructive. They weren't born killers like some of the families we'll encounter later in this series. They were ordinary people who allowed their sense of justice to become perverted into an engine of destruction that ultimately consumed everything they claimed to be fighting for. As we continue our exploration of Appalachia's deadliest families, the McCoys remind us that the most dangerous enemies are often those who believe completely in the righteousness of their cause. When people convince themselves that they're fighting for justice rather than revenge, when they transform personal grievances into cosmic battles between good and evil, they become capable of horrors that would shame ordinary criminals. The mountains of Kentucky still echo with the McCoy legacy. Local historians speak of families who fled the region during the height of the feud and never returned, of bloodlines that were extinguished not through violence, but through the simple inability to imagine a future beyond the cycle of revenge. The McCoys proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing a family can possess isn't weapons or wealth, but an unshakable belief in their own victimhood. Now we venture deeper into these cursed hollows where blood and soil have mixed for so long that the very ground seems to pulse with malevolent life. Our third family proves that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't those who embrace their evil nature, but those who convince themselves they're doing God's work. The Thornwell congregation of Salvation Ridge weren't just killers, they were believers. The Thornwells first arrived in the remote highlands of eastern Tennessee in 1847. led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thornwell, who claimed to have received visions directly from the Almighty. Unlike other mountain families who turned to violence out of desperation or greed, the Thornwells were driven by something far more terrifying: absolute religious conviction combined with a twisted interpretation of divine justice that would make the Spanish Inquisition seem merciful by comparison. What made the Thornwells particularly dangerous wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their ability to convince others that murder was a sacred duty. Ezekiel possessed the kind of magnetic personality that could make rational people abandon their moral compass entirely. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could fill a cathedral without effort, he commanded attention wherever he went. But it was his message that truly corrupted those around him. The Thornwell doctrine was built on a simple but devastating premise. God had chosen their family to cleanse the mountains of sin, and anyone who opposed them was an agent of Satan who deserved immediate divine punishment. This wasn't just religious extremism, it was a carefully constructed theology of violence that provided spiritual justification for any atrocity they chose to commit. The family maintained detailed journals documenting their holy work, written in a mixture of biblical language and detailed descriptions of torture that would shock even hardened law enforcement officers. The Thornwell compound on Salvation Ridge became a fortress of faith and fear. The main building, constructed to resemble a church, complete with bell tower and stained glass windows, served multiple purposes. The sanctuary where Ezekiel delivered his sermons doubled as a courtroom where the family tried those accused of sin. The basement, which they called the purification chamber, was where condemned souls received their earthly punishment before being sent to face eternal judgment. The family's recruitment methods were sophisticated and terrifying. They targeted isolated mountain communities during times of crisis, offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance to desperate families. Ezekiel's sermons combined legitimate biblical passages with his own twisted interpretations, creating a doctrine that seemed almost reasonable until you realized its logical conclusion was mass murder. New converts underwent a gradual indoctrination process that slowly stripped away their individual moral compass and replaced it with unquestioning obedience to Thornwell authority. The first documented Thornwell massacre occurred in 1852 when they attacked a small settlement they claimed was harboring witches. The reality was far more mundane. The community had refused to provide supplies to the Thornwell compound after discovering the family's violent tendencies. The assault was methodical and brutal, with entire families executed in front of their children as Ezekiel quoted scripture about the necessity of purging evil from the land. What made this attack particularly chilling was how the surviving children were immediately adopted into the Thornwell congregation, their trauma used as evidence of their need for spiritual salvation. The family's interpretation of divine justice was both creative and horrifying. They developed an elaborate system of punishments that supposedly matched the spiritual weight of different sins. Theft might result in the removal of hands, adultery in more intimate mutilations, and blasphemy in the cutting out of tongues. But these weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated rituals performed in front of the entire congregation to reinforce the consequences of defying God's chosen family. Perhaps most disturbing was how the Thornwells perverted traditional Christian concepts to justify their actions. They practiced what they called blessed torture, claiming that inflicting pain on sinners was actually an act of mercy that allowed the condemned to experience earthly punishment rather than eternal damnation. This twisted logic enabled them to commit unspeakable atrocities while maintaining their self-image as righteous servants of the divine. The family's influence extended far beyond their mountain stronghold through a network of converts and sympathizers scattered throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. These followers, known as Thornwell witnesses, served as spies and recruiters, identifying potential threats to the family's authority and seeking out new communities that might be vulnerable to their message. The network was so extensive that law enforcement officers investigating Thornwell activities often found their plans anticipated and their movements tracked by people they'd never suspected of involvement. Ezekiel's children were raised from birth to see violence as a form of worship. Family training included not just marksmanship and knife fighting, but also instruction in what they called sacred interrogation techniques, designed to extract confessions from suspected sinners. Children who showed hesitation or compassion during these training sessions were subjected to punishment rituals that reinforced the family's belief that mercy was a weakness that interfered with divine justice. The Thornwell compound included what they called the Valley of Judgment, a narrow ravine where the family conducted their most elaborate executions. The site was carefully chosen for its acoustic properties, which amplified screams throughout the surrounding area as a warning to anyone who might consider opposing Thornwell authority. Archaeological evidence discovered in the 1970s suggests that at least 300 people died in this location over the course of the family's reign of terror. The family's downfall began in 1863 when they made the fatal mistake of attacking a Union Army patrol that had ventured into their territory. The soldiers were investigating reports of Confederate sympathizers in the region, but the Thornwells saw their presence as a challenge to their divine authority that could not be tolerated. The resulting ambush killed 12 federal soldiers and brought the full weight of military justice down on the family's heads. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. 2 companies of Union infantry surrounded the Thornwell compound and demanded unconditional surrender. Ezekiel's response was to gather his followers in the main sanctuary and begin what he called the final purification, a mass suicide ritual that he claimed would transport the faithful directly to heaven while denying their enemies the satisfaction of earthly justice. The siege lasted 3 days, during which the sound of gunfire from within the compound mixed with singing, screaming, and the constant tolling of the chapel bell. When federal forces finally breached the main building, they found a scene that haunted veterans who had witnessed the worst battlefields of the Civil War. Over 60 bodies lay arranged in concentric circles around the altar, with evidence suggesting that many had been killed by family members before the final participants took their own lives. But the Thornwell legacy didn't end with the compound's destruction. Several family members had been away from Salvation Ridge during the siege, and these survivors scattered throughout the Appalachian region, carrying their poisonous doctrine with them. For decades afterward, law enforcement agencies received reports of small religious communities that practiced violent rituals and preached a message suspiciously similar to Ezekiel's twisted theology. The psychological impact of the Thornwell congregation on the broader mountain community was profound and lasting. They had demonstrated how quickly religious conviction could be perverted into a justification for mass murder, and how charismatic leadership could transform ordinary people into willing participants in atrocities. Local churches throughout the region struggled for generations to rebuild trust with communities that had seen how faith could be weaponized by those who claimed to speak for God. Modern historians studying the Thornwell phenomenon have identified patterns that would later appear in other religious extremist movements throughout American history. The combination of isolation, charismatic leadership, and a doctrine that dehumanized outsiders created conditions that allowed normal moral restraints to completely break down. The family's ability to maintain their self-image as righteous servants while committing horrific crimes illustrates how human beings can rationalize almost any behavior when provided with a sufficiently compelling ideological framework. What makes the Thornwell story particularly chilling is how their victims often participated willingly in their own destruction. The family's theological arguments were sophisticated enough to convince many people that accepting punishment for their supposed sins was actually a path to salvation. This psychological manipulation allowed the Thornwells to maintain control through a combination of fear and genuine belief, creating a dynamic that was far more stable than simple intimidation. The physical evidence of Thornwell activities continues to surface occasionally in the Tennessee mountains. Hikers and archaeologists have discovered burial sites containing bodies that show evidence of ritual torture and execution. More disturbing are the journals and religious texts that sometimes emerge from hidden caches containing detailed theological justifications for violence written in the careful handwriting of people who genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose. The Thornwell compound site itself remains largely undisturbed, partly due to its remote location, but also because of persistent local legends about the area being cursed. Visitors report an overwhelming sense of dread when approaching the ruins, and several paranormal investigation teams have documented unexplained phenomena, including disembodied voices, reciting biblical passages, and the sound of chapel bells ringing where no bells exist. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Thornwell legacy is how it corrupted the concept of religious faith for entire communities. Families that had found comfort and guidance in traditional Christian teachings suddenly found themselves questioning whether their pastors might be hiding violent intentions beneath their spiritual message. This erosion of trust in religious authority created a spiritual vacuum that took generations to heal. The Thornwell congregation serves as our third example of Appalachian family violence because it demonstrates how ideology can transform ordinary people into monsters. Unlike the Hatfields, who embraced their outlaw status, or the McCoys, who saw themselves as victims seeking justice, the Thornwells genuinely believed they were heroes in a cosmic battle between good and evil. This conviction made them capable of atrocities that even hardened criminals would hesitate to commit. Their story also reveals how geographic isolation can allow dangerous ideas to flourish without the moderating influence of broader society. Cut off from mainstream religious and legal institutions, the Thornwells were free to develop their own interpretation of divine will without any external checks on their increasingly violent conclusions. The mountains that protected them from outside interference also protected their victims from rescue. The influence of Ezekiel Thornwell's twisted theology can be traced through several later religious movements in the Appalachian region. The combination of biblical literalism, divine authority claims, and violent purification rituals appears repeatedly in the histories of smaller cults and extremist groups throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. While none achieved the Thornwells' level of organization and sustained violence, the ideological foundation they established continued to inspire imitators for decades. Modern law enforcement agencies studying domestic terrorism and religious extremism frequently reference the Thornwell case as an early example of how spiritual authority can be used to justify systematic violence. The family's recruitment methods, indoctrination techniques, and organizational structure provided a template that later groups would adapt for their own purposes. The Thornwells also pioneered the use of children as both victims and perpetrators of violence within a religious framework. Their systematic abuse of young people, justified as spiritual education, created psychological damage that affected multiple generations. Children who survived Thornwell captivity often struggled for the rest of their lives to distinguish between legitimate religious teaching and the violent manipulation they had experienced. As we continue our journey through the deadliest families of Appalachia, the Thornwell congregation reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe completely in the righteousness of their cause. When people convince themselves that they're carrying out divine will, they become capable of horrors that would be unthinkable to ordinary criminals motivated by greed or revenge. The mountains still echo with the legacy of Salvation Ridge. Local historians speak of areas where strange artifacts continue to surface after heavy rains, as if the earth itself is trying to purge the memory of what happened there. The Thornwell name remains cursed in many mountain communities, spoken only in whispers by those old enough to remember the stories their grandparents told about the family that claimed to serve God while doing the devil's work. Their theology of violence, their sophisticated manipulation techniques, and their ability to maintain absolute control over their followers through a combination of fear and faith established them as perhaps the most psychologically dangerous family in Appalachian history. They proved that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who commit their atrocities with tears in their eyes, convinced that every act of cruelty brings them closer to heaven. The shadows grow longer now as we descend deeper into the blood-soaked annals of Appalachian terror. We've witnessed the calculated brutality of the Hatfields, the self-destructive vengeance of the McCoys, and the twisted theology of the Thornwell congregation. But if you thought those families represented the depths of mountain darkness, you haven't met the fourth clan in our deadly series. The Mercer family of Bone Hollow didn't just kill their enemies, they erased them from existence itself. Deep in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist never fully lifts and compasses spin wildly without explanation, the Mercer compound sat like a festering wound in the landscape. Unlike other mountain families who built their power through violence or religion, The Mercers wielded something far more insidious: the complete mastery of fear as both weapon and currency. They didn't just terrorize their victims, they systematically dismantled their sanity until death became a mercy. The Mercer legacy began in 1834 when Silas Mercer arrived in Bone Hollow with his three sons and a wagon load of what locals assumed were farming tools. What they actually were, as later events would prove, were instruments of psychological torture refined through generations of what the family called their craft. Silas wasn't fleeing debt or persecution like other mountain settlers. He was seeking isolation, a place where his family's particular talents could flourish without interference from law enforcement or moral authority. The Mercers understood something that other violent families missed entirely. Physical pain was temporary, but mental anguish could last forever. They developed techniques that would break a person's spirit so completely that even if they survived the encounter, they would spend the rest of their lives as walking testimonies to Mercer power. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was psychological warfare designed to create a buffer zone of terror that extended far beyond their immediate territory. The family compound reflected their sinister expertise. Visitors described buildings that seemed designed to disorient and disturb, hallways that led nowhere, doors that opened onto solid walls, rooms with ceilings so low they forced visitors to crawl, and windows positioned to provide views of carefully arranged scenes of decay and death. The Mercers had transformed their homestead into a three-dimensional manifestation of nightmare, a place where reality itself seemed unstable. What made the Mercers particularly dangerous was their patient, methodical approach to victim selection. Unlike families who struck in moments of passion or desperation, the Mercers would study their targets for months, learning their fears, their weaknesses, their deepest secrets. They maintained detailed files on hundreds of people throughout the region, cataloging psychological vulnerabilities with the precision of military intelligence. The family's signature technique, which they called the long goodbye, involved a campaign of escalating psychological pressure that could last for years. It began subtly. Personal items would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Familiar landmarks would be slightly altered. Trusted friends would suddenly act differently. The victim would begin to question their own memory, their own sanity, their own perception of reality. As the campaign intensified, the Mercers would introduce elements that pushed their targets toward complete mental collapse. Loved ones who had died years earlier would be glimpsed in crowds. Childhood fears would manifest in adult environments. Familiar voices would whisper threats from empty rooms. The victim would find themselves trapped in a waking nightmare where the boundary between reality and hallucination had been deliberately erased. The most chilling aspect of the Mercer methodology was how it transformed victims into unwilling accomplices in their own destruction. By the time the long goodbye reached its conclusion, most targets were so desperate for the torment to end that they would do anything the Mercers demanded. Some became informants, providing intelligence about other potential victims. Others committed crimes at Mercer direction, creating a network of compromised individuals throughout the region. Those who tried to resist or flee discovered the true scope of Mercer influence. The family had spent decades cultivating relationships with merchants, postal workers, railroad employees, and even some law enforcement officers. Not through bribery or intimidation, but through the careful application of their psychological techniques. These weren't willing collaborators. They were broken people who had learned that cooperation with the Mercers was the only way to maintain even a semblance of mental stability. The Mercer children were raised from birth to see human suffering as an art form requiring constant refinement. Family training included detailed instruction in human psychology, the mechanics of fear, and the precise application of stress to achieve maximum psychological damage. Children who showed aptitude for the family craft were rewarded with additional training and responsibility. Those who displayed compassion or hesitation faced the same techniques used on outsiders until their natural empathy was completely extinguished. The family maintained what they called the collection, a series of rooms where they displayed trophies from their psychological campaigns. These weren't physical objects like scalps or weapons, but rather journals, sketches, and recordings that documented the mental deterioration of their victims. The Mercers took particular pride in before and after photographs that showed the physical transformation that accompanied complete psychological breakdown. Local law enforcement agencies struggled to investigate Mercer activities because their crimes existed in a gray area between legal harassment and actionable threats. By the time victims were ready to file complaints, their credibility had been so thoroughly undermined that officials dismissed them as mentally unstable. The few investigators who took reports seriously found themselves targets of Mercer attention, quickly discovering why their predecessors had chosen to look the other way. The family's influence reached its peak during the 1870s when they controlled a territory spanning 3 counties. Communities within this region lived in a state of constant low-level terror, never knowing who might be selected for the next long goodbye campaign. Social cohesion broke down as neighbors began to suspect each other of being Mercer agents. Marriages failed, businesses collapsed, and entire families fled the region rather than risk attracting Mercer attention. The techniques pioneered by the Mercers were sophisticated enough to influence criminal psychology for generations. Modern experts studying their methods have identified tactics that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology until the 20th century. The family had developed an intuitive understanding of concepts like learned helplessness, psychological conditioning, and trauma bonding decades before these phenomena were scientifically documented. Perhaps most disturbing was the Mercer approach to children, both their own and their victims. They understood that psychological patterns established in childhood could last a lifetime, making young people ideal targets for long-term manipulation. Children who survived Mercer attention often grew up to become isolated, paranoid adults who passed their trauma to the next generation, creating ripple effects that extended the family's influence across decades. The Mercer compound included what they called the teaching rooms, specially constructed chambers where family members refined their techniques on captured subjects. These rooms were designed to maximize psychological discomfort while leaving no physical evidence of abuse. Survivors who later escaped described spaces that seemed to shift and change, where up and down became meaningless, where familiar sounds were mixed with disturbing frequencies that created profound unease. The family's record keeping was meticulous and disturbing. They maintained detailed case studies of their psychological campaigns, noting which techniques worked best on different personality types, how various forms of pressure could be combined for maximum effect, and how to identify the precise moment when a victim's resistance finally collapsed. These records were written in a clinical, almost scientific tone that made their contents even more horrifying. The Mercers also pioneered the use of what they called proxy techniques, methods for attacking victims through their relationships with others. Rather than targeting an individual directly, they would focus their attention on family members, friends, or business associates, creating a web of psychological pressure that isolated their primary target and made resistance virtually impossible. This approach allowed them to maintain plausible deniability while still achieving their objectives. The family's downfall began in 1881 when they made the fatal mistake of targeting the wrong victim. Federal Judge Marcus Whitfield had been investigating reports of organized criminal activity in the region when his teenage daughter began experiencing the early stages of a long goodbye campaign. Unlike previous victims, Whitfield had both the resources and the authority to launch a comprehensive investigation into Mercer activities. The federal response was unprecedented in both scope and determination. Rather than relying on local law enforcement, Whitfield brought in investigators from outside the region, men who had no prior exposure to Mercer influence and were therefore immune to their psychological techniques. The investigation team included military veterans who had experience with interrogation and psychological warfare, giving them insight into Mercer methods that previous investigators had lacked. What the federal team discovered at the Mercer compound shocked even hardened law enforcement veterans. The teaching rooms contained evidence of psychological torture on a scale that challenged contemporary understanding of human cruelty. The collection included documentation of campaigns that had driven dozens of victims to suicide, madness, or complete psychological collapse. Most disturbing were the family records that revealed the true scope of their influence throughout the region. The final confrontation occurred during a winter storm that cut the compound off from outside communication. Federal agents surrounded the property and demanded surrender, but the Mercers responded with their ultimate psychological weapon. They began a campaign designed to break the minds of the investigators themselves. For 3 days, the agents were subjected to a coordinated assault involving sleep deprivation, auditory harassment, and carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. Several investigators suffered nervous breakdowns during the siege, but the federal team's military training and outside support allowed them to maintain their mission focus. When they finally breached the compound, they found a scene that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The Mercers had turned their psychological techniques on themselves rather than face capture, creating a tableau of madness and death that defied rational description. The investigation into Mercer activities was classified almost immediately, with most evidence being sealed in federal archives that remain closed to this day. Official records indicate only that a criminal organization operating in eastern Kentucky was successfully dismantled, with no mention of the psychological techniques that made the family so dangerous. The few investigators willing to discuss the case spoke only of methodologies that seemed to anticipate developments in criminal psychology by several decades. The Mercer compound was burned to the ground by federal order, and the surrounding area was quietly purchased by the government and designated as protected wilderness. Local residents were relocated with generous federal compensation, though many reported continuing psychological difficulties that lasted for years after leaving the region. The official explanation cited concerns about toxic mineral deposits, but locals understood the real reason for the evacuation. The psychological impact of the Mercer legacy extended far beyond their immediate victims. Mental health professionals in the region reported a dramatic increase in cases involving paranoia, depression, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Entire families required ongoing treatment for psychological damage that seemed to have no obvious cause, creating a pattern of trauma that affected multiple generations. Modern criminal psychologists studying the limited available records have identified Mercer techniques in several 20th century cases involving organized crime and domestic terrorism. The family's understanding of psychological manipulation was so advanced that their methods have been linked to interrogation techniques used by various government agencies and criminal organizations throughout the world. The Bone Hollow region remains largely uninhabited to this day, despite its natural beauty and valuable timber resources. Hikers and researchers who venture into the area report an overwhelming sense of unease that seems to emanate from the landscape itself. Electronic equipment malfunctions frequently, compasses spin wildly, and many visitors report disorientation that persists long after leaving the region. Perhaps most troubling are the reports from mental health professionals who have treated individuals claiming to be descended from Mercer family members. These patients display an unusual understanding of psychological manipulation techniques and often report family traditions involving what they describe as mind games or mental exercises that seem designed to break down psychological resistance. Several have requested protection from family members they claim are continuing Mercer practices in modified forms. The Mercer story serves as our fourth example of Appalachian family violence because it demonstrates how intelligence and patience can be more dangerous than raw brutality. Unlike families who relied on physical intimidation or religious fervor, the Mercers understood that the human mind was the ultimate battlefield. Their legacy reveals how psychological techniques can be used to create networks of control that extend far beyond immediate physical reach. Their methodical approach to victim selection, their sophisticated understanding of human psychology, and their ability to maintain influence through fear rather than force established them as perhaps the most scientifically dangerous family in Appalachian history. They proved that in the right hands, psychological manipulation could be more effective than any weapon, creating damage that lasted for generations and influenced criminal behavior patterns well into the modern era. The mountains of Kentucky still echo with the Mercer legacy. Mental health professionals in the region speak of generational trauma patterns that seem to have no identifiable cause, of families whose psychological difficulties can be traced back to the 1870s but have no documented connection to any traumatic event. The Mercers demonstrated that some forms of violence leave wounds that never heal, creating damage that passes from parent to child like a hereditary disease. As we continue our exploration of Appalachia's deadliest families, the Mercers remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who hunt minds rather than bodies. Their sophisticated understanding of human psychology, combined with the isolation and lawlessness of the mountain environment, created conditions for the development of criminal techniques that wouldn't be fully understood by legitimate science for decades. The federal government's response to the Mercer threat, including the classification of evidence and the forced relocation of local residents, suggests that their capabilities may have been even more extensive than surviving records indicate. The fact that their methods continue to surface in modern criminal cases implies that some knowledge of their techniques survived the destruction of their compound, passed down through channels that remain hidden from official scrutiny. Now we turn to our final family in this dark series, a bloodline that makes even the Mercers seem almost human by comparison. The Ashford clan of Devil's Backbone Ridge didn't just break minds or bodies, they broke the very concept of death itself, creating a legacy so horrifying that even mentioning their name was considered an invitation to supernatural retribution. In the deepest, most isolated reaches of the West Virginia mountains, where maps showed only empty space and compasses pointed toward magnetic anomalies that geologists couldn't explain, the Ashford family established what can only be described as a kingdom of the damned. For nearly a century, from 1823 to 1919, they maintained a reign of terror so complete and so supernatural in its implications that even today, over 100 years later, the area around Devil's Backbone Ridge remains officially uninhabitable. The Ashfords weren't just another violent mountain family. They were practitioners of what they called the old arrangements, ritual practices that combined elements of European witchcraft, Cherokee shamanism, and something far older and more malevolent that seemed to predate human civilization entirely. Their power wasn't based on guns or intimidation, but on their apparent ability to command forces that operated beyond the normal laws of nature. The family's founder, Cornelius Ashford, arrived in West Virginia in 1823, carrying nothing but a leather satchel filled with objects that local merchants refused to examine closely. Those who caught glimpses of the contents described items that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, artifacts that appeared to be carved from materials that didn't exist in nature. Cornelius claimed to be a scholar of natural philosophy, but his research involved practices that had more in common with medieval necromancy than any legitimate science. The Ashford compound on Devil's Backbone Ridge became legendary throughout the region for all the wrong reasons. The main house was constructed according to architectural principles that seemed designed to violate human spatial perception. Rooms connected in ways that created impossible geometries, with hallways that formed closed loops despite appearing to run in straight lines. Visitors reported becoming lost in corridors that should have been too small to accommodate a grown person, emerging hours later from rooms they were certain they had never entered. What distinguished the Ashfords from other dangerous families was their relationship with death itself. They didn't just kill their enemies, they prevented them from dying properly. Witnesses reported seeing individuals who had been confirmed dead walking the grounds of the Ashford compound, not as reanimated corpses, but as conscious beings trapped in a state between life and death. These unfortunates retained their memories and personalities, but were bound to serve the Ashford family in ways that violated every natural law. The family's signature practice, known as the binding, involved rituals that could supposedly capture the essence of a dying person and prevent their spirit from departing their body. The process required elaborate preparations, including the collection of specific minerals found only in certain caves, the harvesting of plants that grew exclusively in areas where violent deaths had occurred, and the participation of multiple family members in ceremonies that could last for days. Local residents lived in terror, not just of Ashford violence, but of Ashford attention. The family was known to collect people who possessed particular skills or knowledge, not through kidnapping or coercion, but through rituals that created supernatural compulsions. Blacksmiths, herbalists, musicians, and even children with unusual abilities would simply abandon their lives and walk into the mountains, drawn by forces they couldn't understand or resist. The Ashford children were raised from birth to see the boundary between life and death as fluid and negotiable. Family education included instruction in what they called the deeper sciences, knowledge that combined legitimate medical and chemical learning with practices that bordered on supernatural. Children who showed aptitude for the family traditions were gradually introduced to increasingly disturbing rituals, while those who resisted faced fates that were described as worse than death. The family maintained what they called the preserve, a series of underground chambers where they kept their collection of bound servants. These weren't ordinary prisoners or slaves, but individuals who had been prevented from dying and were therefore immune to normal physical limitations. They required no food, no sleep, and no rest, making them ideal workers for projects that would have been impossible for living people to complete. The Ashfords used their supernatural servants to create an extensive network of tunnels and chambers throughout Devil's Backbone Ridge. These underground spaces served multiple purposes: as workshops for their ritual practices, as storage areas for their growing collection of artifacts and specimens, and as laboratories where they conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of natural law. The tunnels also provided hidden routes that allowed family members to appear and disappear without being tracked by potential enemies. Perhaps most disturbing was the family's practice of what they called harvesting, the systematic collection of human experiences and emotions for use in their rituals. They believed that powerful emotions, particularly those associated with fear, love, and despair, could be captured and stored in specially prepared objects. The Ashfords would create elaborate scenarios designed to evoke specific emotional responses, then use those responses as raw material for their supernatural workings. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of what they called touched individuals, people who had been subjected to minor Ashford rituals that created permanent psychological and spiritual connections. These people continued to live normal lives, but served as unwitting spies and agents, providing the Ashfords with information about events throughout the region and sometimes being compelled to perform specific actions at crucial moments. Local law enforcement agencies found it virtually impossible to investigate Ashford activities because witnesses either disappeared or suffered psychological breakdowns that left them incapable of providing coherent testimony. The few officials who attempted serious investigations reported equipment failures, navigation problems, and disturbing dreams that persisted until they abandoned their inquiries. Several sheriffs and federal marshals simply resigned rather than continue their efforts to penetrate Ashford territory. The family's power reached its peak during the Civil War, when both Union and Confederate forces learned to avoid Devil's Backbone Ridge entirely. Military units that entered the area reported losing entire companies to unexplained disappearances, with search parties finding only empty uniforms arranged in patterns that suggested some form of ritualistic purpose. The few soldiers who returned from encounters with the Ashfords were usually found wandering in circles, unable to remember their own names or military assignments. The Ashfords took advantage of the war's chaos to expand their collection dramatically, using the binding process on soldiers from both armies who were unfortunate enough to venture into their territory. These military servants provided the family with advanced knowledge of weapons, tactics, and engineering that they used to further fortify their compound and extend their underground network. By war's end, the Ashford Preserve reportedly contained hundreds of bound individuals representing a cross-section of American society. The family's downfall began in 1917 when they made the critical error of binding a federal investigator who had been sent to examine reports of draft evasion in the region. Unlike previous law enforcement officers, Agent Thomas Blackwood possessed unusual resistance to supernatural influence, possibly due to his own family's history of dealing with occult phenomena. Rather than disappearing or suffering a psychological breakdown, Blackwood was able to gather detailed intelligence about Ashford activities before his eventual capture. Blackwood's reports, transmitted through a network of federal agents positioned outside Ashford influence, provided the first comprehensive documentation of the family's supernatural capabilities. The federal response was swift and overwhelming, involving not just law enforcement, but also military units trained in unconventional warfare and consultation with individuals who possessed specialized knowledge of occult practices. The final assault on the Ashford compound required nearly 2 years of preparation and involved resources that remained classified for decades afterward. Federal forces surrounded Devil's Backbone Ridge with a combination of conventional military equipment and protective measures designed to counter supernatural attack. The siege lasted for 6 months, during which both sides employed tactics that challenged conventional understanding of warfare. The end came suddenly and catastrophically when federal forces breached the main underground chambers and discovered the true scope of Ashford activities. The preserve contained not hundreds, but thousands of bound servants, representing over a century of supernatural kidnapping and ritual murder. The sight of so many trapped souls reportedly drove several federal agents insane, while others suffered permanent psychological damage that required lifelong treatment. The federal team also discovered extensive records documenting Ashford experiments with what they called the fundamental forces, research that seemed to involve attempts to manipulate basic principles of reality, including time, space, and causation. These documents were immediately classified at the highest levels, with access restricted to a handful of specialists who possessed both scientific training and psychological resistance to disturbing information. The destruction of the Ashford compound required more than conventional explosives. Federal forces used techniques that were never officially documented, but local residents reported seeing lights and hearing sounds that suggested the involvement of forces beyond normal military capability. The underground network was systematically collapsed. The main buildings were reduced to ash, and the entire ridge was subjected to procedures that left the soil itself seemingly lifeless. The fate of the Ashford family members remains classified, but federal records suggest that some were captured alive and transported to undisclosed locations for interrogation and study. The bound servants posed a more complex problem, as traditional methods of execution proved ineffective against individuals who had already been prevented from dying. The solution reportedly involved rituals that reversed the binding process, finally allowing these tortured souls to achieve the death that had been denied them for decades or even centuries. The Devil's Backbone Ridge area was immediately designated as a federal preserve, with access restricted to authorized personnel only. Official documents cited environmental contamination and geological instability, but locals understood the real reason for the prohibition. The region had been so thoroughly corrupted by Ashford activities that it posed an ongoing threat to anyone who entered unprepared. Even today, over a century after the Ashford compound was destroyed, the area remains effectively uninhabitable. Hikers who ignore warning signs report equipment failures, navigation problems, and psychological disturbances that persist long after leaving the region. Several research teams have attempted to study the site, but all have been forced to abandon their work due to what they describe as hostile environmental conditions that seem to actively resist human presence. The Ashford legacy continues to influence government policy regarding supernatural threats. The protocols developed for dealing with the family have reportedly been updated and refined over the decades, creating a framework for responding to similar situations should they arise. The existence of this specialized capability suggests that the Ashfords may not have been unique in their supernatural abilities, but merely the most documented example of such phenomena. Modern researchers, studying the limited available records, have identified Ashford influences in several unexplained historical events, suggesting that the family's activities may have had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond their immediate territory. The binding process appears to have been particularly significant, as similar techniques have been reported in various occult traditions throughout the world, implying that the Ashfords may have been part of a larger network of supernatural practitioners. The psychological impact of the Ashford case on federal personnel involved in the investigation was severe and long-lasting. Many agents suffered recurring nightmares, developed unusual phobias, and reported sensing supernatural presences in their daily lives. The government eventually established specialized psychological support services for personnel exposed to what were classified as anomalous phenomena, creating precedents that continue to influence how such cases are handled today. The Ashford story serves as our final example of Appalachian family violence because it represents the absolute extreme of what isolation, desperation, and moral corruption can produce when combined with knowledge that should never have been possessed by human beings. Their legacy reminds us that some forms of evil transcend ordinary criminal behavior, entering realms that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality itself. As our journey through the deadliest families of Appalachia concludes, the Ashfords stand as a testament to the darkest possibilities of human nature when freed from the constraints of law, morality, and natural limitation. Their story reveals depths of horror that most people prefer not to acknowledge, realities that exist just beyond the edge of normal human experience, waiting in the shadows of our oldest mountains. The 5 families we've encountered in this series represent different aspects of the violence and depravity that can flourish in isolated environments where traditional authority holds no sway. From the calculated brutality of the Hatfields to the supernatural horrors of the Ashfords, each bloodline found their own path to power through methods that civilized society would consider unthinkable. These stories persist in mountain folklore not as entertainment, but as warnings about what can happen when human beings are pushed beyond the breaking point of moral and social constraint. They remind us that civilization is a fragile construction that can collapse quickly when the right combination of pressure, isolation, and opportunity creates conditions for the emergence of true monsters. The mountains keep their secrets well, but occasionally the veil lifts enough to reveal glimpses of the darkness that still lurks in their deepest hollows. The families we've examined may be gone, but their legacies continue to shape the landscape and the people who call these ancient hills home. Some wounds never heal, and some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how much time passes or how thoroughly the evidence has been destroyed. The mountains of West Virginia still echo with the memory of Devil's Backbone Ridge, but there are other places in these ancient hills where the very air seems to remember acts so heinous that even speaking of them feels like an invitation to darkness. Our final family in this series makes all the others seem almost quaint by comparison. The Grimsdale clan didn't just kill their enemies or practice twisted rituals. They discovered something in the deepest caves of Appalachia that transformed them into something that defied every natural law, something that made death itself seem like mercy. In the winter of 1847, when the snow lay so deep that entire settlements were cut off from the outside world for months, the Grimsdale family made a discovery that would curse their bloodline for generations. Deep beneath Raven's Hollow, in caverns that appeared on no geological survey, they found chambers that seemed to breathe with their own malevolent life. What they brought back to the surface with them wasn't treasure or coal, but knowledge that human minds were never meant to possess. The Grimsdales had always been different from other mountain families. Where others sought power through violence or supernatural practices, the Grimsdales pursued something far more dangerous. They wanted to understand the fundamental forces that governed life and death itself. Their patriarch, Mordecai Grimsdale, had arrived in the mountains carrying books written in languages that predated human civilization, texts that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The family compound reflected their otherworldly pursuits. Built into the side of Raven's Hollow like a cancer growing from the mountain itself, the structure defied conventional architecture. Rooms connected through passages that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, with corridors that led to chambers that were somehow larger than the spaces that contained them. Visitors who managed to find the compound reported that compasses spun wildly in its vicinity, and that time itself seemed to flow differently within its walls. What made the Grimsdales truly terrifying wasn't their willingness to experiment on human subjects, though they certainly did that with enthusiasm that would have impressed the most dedicated natural philosopher. It was their apparent success in these experiments. They had discovered methods for extending human life indefinitely, but the cost was a transformation that left their subjects barely recognizable as the people they had once been. The family's signature practice involved what they called the Great Work, a series of procedures that supposedly granted immortality at the cost of everything that made a person human. Subjects would be taken to the deepest levels of the compound, where they underwent processes that lasted for weeks or sometimes months. Those who survived emerged as something fundamentally different, possessing abilities that violated every natural law but existing in a state that could hardly be called living. Local residents learned to recognize the signs of Grimsdale attention. Livestock would begin behaving strangely, moving in synchronized patterns that suggested some form of hive mind. Wild animals would be found arranged in geometric patterns, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes reflecting light in ways that animal eyes never should. Most disturbing were the sounds that echoed from the direction of Raven's Hollow on certain nights, noises that seemed to come from human throats but contained harmonics that suggested vocal cords modified beyond recognition. The Grimsdale children were raised from birth to see humanity as raw material for their family's experiments. They learned anatomy before they learned arithmetic, studying the mechanisms of pain and terror with the same dedication that other children applied to their letters. By adolescence, most Grimsdale offspring had performed procedures on living subjects that would have broken the minds of trained physicians. The family maintained extensive laboratories beneath their compound, chambers equipped with devices that seemed to blend advanced engineering with supernatural principles. These workshops contained preservation tanks filled with specimens that defied classification, instruments designed to measure forces that conventional science insisted didn't exist, and detailed charts mapping the progression of their experimental subjects through various stages of transformation. Perhaps most chilling was the Grimsdale approach to record keeping. They documented their work with scientific precision, but their journals were written in a mixture of clinical observation and something approaching religious ecstasy. They saw themselves as pioneers exploring the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and oblivion, human and something else entirely. Their writings suggest they believed they were evolving humanity into a higher form of existence, one that would survive long after the natural world had ended. The family's influence extended throughout the region through a network of what they called their improved subjects. These were individuals who had undergone partial transformation, retaining enough of their human appearance to move freely through normal society while serving as the Grimsdale's eyes and ears. Many prominent citizens throughout the mountains unknowingly employed these agents, never realizing that their trusted servants or business partners reported every detail of their lives to the compound in Raven's Hollow. The Grimsdales also pioneered techniques for what they termed consciousness transfer, procedures that supposedly allowed them to move their awareness from one body to another as their original forms wore out. This practice meant that family members who appeared to die would sometimes reappear years later in different bodies, continuing their work with memories and personalities intact. Death became merely an inconvenience rather than an ending. The family's downfall began in 1919 when they made the catastrophic error of targeting a federal inspector who had come to investigate reports of missing persons in the region. Unlike their usual victims, Agent Samuel Morrison possessed both extensive government resources and unusual resistance to the psychological techniques the Grimsdales used to control their subjects. When Morrison failed to report back to his superiors, the federal response was swift and overwhelming. The siege of Ravens Hollow required resources that remained classified for decades afterward. Federal forces surrounded the compound with equipment that suggested they had some understanding of the unusual nature of their opponents. The assault teams included not just military personnel, but also specialists whose backgrounds and expertise were never officially documented. The final battle lasted for 3 days, during which local residents reported phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The sky above Ravens Hollow flickered between day and night without regard to the actual time. Animals throughout the region fled as if responding to some primal instinct that warned of approaching catastrophe. Most disturbing were the sounds that emerged from the compound, noises that seemed to contain the voices of hundreds of people screaming in languages that predated human speech. When federal forces finally breached the compound, they discovered a scene that would influence government policy regarding supernatural threats for generations. The laboratories contained evidence of experiments that had produced results beyond anything conventional science could explain. Preservation tanks held specimens that appeared to be conscious despite having no discernible nervous systems. Other containers showed evidence of subjects who had been maintained in various stages of transformation for what appeared to be decades. The Grimsdale family members themselves posed unique challenges for the assault teams. Several appeared to die multiple times during the conflict, only to reappear elsewhere in the compound apparently unharmed. Others seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, making it difficult to determine how many family members were actually present. The resolution came only when federal forces used techniques that were never officially documented, involving procedures that suggested government knowledge of supernatural phenomena that exceeded public understanding. The aftermath of the Ravens Hollow incident was handled with unprecedented secrecy. The entire region was evacuated under the cover story of a mining accident that had released toxic gases. The compound was not just destroyed, but subjected to processes that left the bedrock itself somehow sterilized, as if the very molecules had been rearranged to prevent any contamination from spreading. Most disturbing were the discoveries made in the deepest levels of the compound, chambers that federal investigators described as existing in violation of three-dimensional space. These areas contained archives documenting Grimsdale experiments spanning over a century, along with evidence suggesting their work was part of a larger project involving similar families in other remote locations. The implications were so disturbing that most of the evidence was immediately classified at levels that restricted access to fewer than a dozen individuals worldwide. The psychological impact of the Ravens Hollow incident on federal personnel was severe and lasting. Several team members suffered complete psychological breakdowns after witnessing what they found in the compound. Others reported recurring nightmares featuring scenarios that seemed to be memories of experiences they had never actually lived. The government eventually established specialized treatment programs for personnel exposed to what were classified as anomalous phenomena, creating protocols that continue to influence how such cases are handled today. The Grimsdale legacy extends far beyond their immediate activities. Modern researchers studying the limited available records have identified connections between their work and several unexplained historical events, suggesting that their influence may have reached much further than anyone realized. The techniques they developed for consciousness transfer and biological modification appear to have influenced various scientific and military programs throughout the 20th century, though the exact nature of these connections remains heavily classified. Perhaps most troubling are the reports that continue to emerge from the Ravens Hollow region. Despite the thorough destruction of the compound and the official declaration that the area is safe, local residents still report strange phenomena. Electronic equipment malfunctions without explanation. Visitors experience disorientation and memory loss. Most disturbing are the sightings of figures that appear human but move in ways that suggest their internal structure has been fundamentally altered. The Grimsdale story serves as our final example of Appalachian family violence because it represents the ultimate expression of what happens when human beings abandon every moral and natural constraint in pursuit of power. Their legacy demonstrates that some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for human minds to possess, and that certain boundaries should never be crossed, regardless of the potential benefits. Modern criminal psychologists studying the available records have identified Grimsdale influences in several contemporary cases involving organized crime and domestic terrorism. Their methods for psychological manipulation and biological modification appear to have been adapted by various groups throughout the world, suggesting that some aspects of their knowledge survived the destruction of their compound through channels that remain hidden from official scrutiny. The federal government's response to the Grimsdale threat established precedents that continue to influence how authorities handle cases involving supernatural or anomalous phenomena. The protocols developed for containing and eliminating the family have reportedly been updated and refined over the decades, creating a framework for dealing with similar threats should they arise. The existence of these specialized capabilities suggests that the Grimsdales may not have been unique in their abilities, but merely the most documented example of such phenomena. The Ravens Hollow region remains officially uninhabitable, designated as a protected wilderness area, with access restricted to authorized personnel only. The official explanation cites environmental contamination, but local residents understand the real reason for the prohibition. The area has been so thoroughly corrupted by Grimsdale activities that it poses an ongoing threat to anyone who enters unprepared for what they might encounter. Even today, over a century after the compound was destroyed, researchers occasionally discover evidence of Grimsdale influence in unexpected places. Documents surface in old archives containing research that seems to anticipate scientific developments by decades. Medical records show treatment for conditions that shouldn't have existed when they were documented. Most disturbing are the genealogical studies that suggest certain bloodlines throughout the region show genetic modifications that cannot be explained by natural selection or conventional medical intervention. The Grimsdale name itself has become synonymous with forbidden knowledge and dangerous experimentation. Academic researchers who attempt to study their work find funding mysteriously withdrawn and access to resources unexpectedly denied. Several historians who showed too much interest in the family have reportedly suffered accidents or simply disappeared from academic circles, their research notes found burned or destroyed. As we conclude our journey through the deadliest families of Appalachia, the Grimsdales stand as the ultimate warning about what can happen when human beings venture too far beyond the boundaries of natural law. Their story reveals that some secrets are hidden not to protect the powerful, but to protect humanity itself from knowledge that could destroy everything we understand about life, death, and consciousness. The 7 families we've encountered in this series each found their own path to power through methods that civilized society would consider unthinkable. From the calculated brutality of the Hatfields to the religious extremism of the Thornwells, from the psychological warfare of the Mercers to the supernatural horrors of the Ashfords, and finally to the ultimate abomination of the Grimsdales, each bloodline pushed the boundaries of human behavior further into darkness. These stories persist in mountain folklore, not as entertainment, but as warnings about what can happen when isolation, desperation, and the absence of moral authority create conditions for true evil to flourish. They remind us that civilization is a fragile construction that can collapse quickly when the right combination of circumstances allows the worst aspects of human nature to emerge unchecked. The mountains of Appalachia still hold their secrets close, but occasionally the veil lifts enough to reveal glimpses of the darkness that lurks in their deepest hollows. The families we've examined may be gone, but their legacies continue to shape the landscape and the people who call these ancient hills home. Some wounds never heal, and some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten, no matter how desperately we might wish to purge it from human memory. The federal government's continued interest in these cases, evidenced by the ongoing classification of documents and the maintenance of restricted areas throughout the region, suggests that the threat these families represented has not been entirely eliminated. Whether through hidden descendants, preserved knowledge, or something more sinister, the possibility remains that somewhere in the mist-shrouded valleys of Appalachia, the old ways persist, waiting for the right conditions to emerge once again. As night falls across the ancient peaks and the shadows grow long in the hollows, local residents still speak in hushed tones of lights seen where no lights should be, of voices heard in languages that predate human speech, and of the unsettling feeling that something inhuman watches from the darkness. The mountains remember everything, and they forgive nothing. In these remote valleys, where cell signals fail and GPS systems provide false readings, the boundary between legend and reality remains as thin as morning mist, and the price of curiosity about certain family histories may be higher than any reasonable person would be willing to pay. The deadliest families of Appalachia have left their mark on American history in ways that most people will never realize. Their influence extends far beyond their immediate victims, shaping government policy, influencing scientific research, and creating precedents for dealing with threats that exist beyond the normal understanding of law enforcement. They proved that in the right circumstances, a single family can create their own reality, their own laws, and their own version of justice that defies every civilized principle. Their stories serve as a reminder that evil is not just the absence of good, but an active force that can corrupt everything it touches, spreading like poison through bloodlines and across generations until entire regions become infected with its influence. The mountains of Appalachia stand as monuments to human resilience, but also as warnings about what happens when that resilience is twisted into something darker, more dangerous, and ultimately more destructive than anything nature itself could devise.